My name is Brendan, and this is another video in my ongoing series on sound design and synthesis, and how to turn the sounds that are in your head into real synthesizers you can use in your tracks. As always, I'm going to be using the free cross-platform synth software Helm to highlight some of the principles I'll be talking about. But most of what I'll be talking about throughout this series and in this video will be applicable to just about any synth you can use, whether that be digital or an analog hardware synth. Although I will say tonight we'll be going over some of the unique features of Helm as far as its modulation, but a lot of the principles will apply to, a large amount of synths. They might just look a little bit different. But the key principle of using modulation as a way to affect a certain parameter over time is pretty universal to synthesizers. I have next to me an Arturia Micro Brute and Micro Freak. I have a Basel Castle somewhere in here. Pretty much all my synths, what few I have, do have, pretty extensive modulation capacity. And I think it's sort of becoming more and more the case as modular synths are becoming a bit more popular, to have some sort of, a way to change parameters over time. And I think before I get too much further in, I'd like to just really lay out in pretty clear terms what exactly modulation is. And I'm going to apologize in advance if I use a couple different terms interchangeably. I, sometimes refer to, the thing being modulated as a target or a parameter, something like that. But I'm just referring to what is the thing that you are going to be changing over time. Because that's really what modulation is, right? It's a way for us to, rather than, having to use a million different hands and turn a million different knobs manually exactly when we want them to change the tuning of an oscillator or the volume of an oscillator, or the amount of a delay that we want in the mix or the frequency of the filter, because we don't have hands to change all those things manually. And frankly, it's a lot of work and a lot of stress to manage that in a live setting. Modulation is a way to use a variety of different sources to turn those knobs for you. And you can do that either, using an envelope so that it follows, a particular path. There's a certain amount of time before it reaches a peak and then it decays and releases, etc. Or you could set it to a more rhythmic, regular, repeating modulation source like an LFO or the step sequencer, which is a really great key, or is a really great feature in Helm. And you can even have them mapped to different parameters in your keyboard, such as the velocity, how hard you hit the key, things like that. And we'll get into each of those different modulation types over tonight's video, but the key thing is just to understand that modulation is just using a particular source, a modulator, to change a parameter, a target, a knob, like, this transpose knob or an oscillator volume, things like that, over time. And usually, the modulator starts whenever you hit the key in Helm. That's when the modulation starts, but there are, some exceptions to that. And we'll get into those, throughout the evening. But I think before we get too much into the theory of it, let's just listen to some examples of it so you can really hear what this idea is. So let's think of a common example that I might use, which is maybe I have a couple different oscillators. Let's say maybe I have, a sawtooth wave here, and I have a triangle wave here. And maybe I want to have this sawtooth wave be my main synth, my main oscillator. And I want this second oscillator to sort of fade in as the sound evolves. The problem is, though, that my amplitude for this sound overall is going to be something like this, where it's pretty fast attack, and it would be hard to find a way to use this, amplitude envelope to change my oscillator volume. So what I can do instead, if I was doing it in a live setting, maybe I would, if this was the only thing I had to change, well, I would say it's easy enough. I'll just press a button, and I'll just, manually increase this over time. And let's say maybe it's even, tuned up a fifth so we can really hear it. So let's hear that. That's sort of the sound I want, right? I press the note and gradually this increases. But instead of using, one of my very precious free hands to manually move that slider up, instead I can automate it using a modulator. So I'm going to do just that by using our modulator envelope, the mod envelope here. And as a brief digression, all three of these envelopes can work pretty much the same way as modulators. The amplitude envelope is always hardwired to the volume of the synthesizer, and the filter envelope is always hardwired to the envelope, the filter, frequency envelope here. But if the filter's not on, it doesn't change anything. And even if the filter's on and the envelope depth is not set to anything, the filter envelope doesn't do anything. So, these are things that you can use as modulators for anything, even though they have these different names. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But for tonight, I'm going to make it kind of easy, and I'm just going to use the mod envelope, which is not by default affecting anything at all. And I've sort of just, drawn here what I think the shape is that I want for this effect. Because I'm thinking I want to change the volume of this oscillator over time using a modulator. So I'm going to set sort of a gradual incline, just like we did in our amplitude envelope in the last video, where I made sort of that string sound. There's a gradual increase over time. It'll reach a peak, and then it'll sort of taper off. Or, it'll reach a sustain at a certain volume, which I think I'd like the sustain to be below, the range of the oscillator one. So it, is not overtaking the mix. So that's, more or less the shape that I want. But how do I set it to the volume of oscillator 2? Well, now that I know my target, the parameter I want to change, which is oscillator 2, and I know what it is that I want to be modulating it, what is going to change this sound over time, it's the modulator envelope, I can make a link between the two of them. And to do that in Helm, you're going to click on this little helmet next to your modulator source, which is just the thing that's changing your target. So I'm going to click this helmet next to my mod envelope. Boop. And two things will change. The little change is that now there's a little blue helmet next to it. That shows you that this is the active modulator, which means that right now, if you change any effects, they're being mapped to this mod envelope instead of the filter envelope or what have you. The other, much bigger change is that a ton of stuff is now green. And the amazing thing is that all of those different green parameters are things that we can modulate. Not necessarily, with this mod envelope, but they are all possibilities for things that we can modulate in Helm. And, the mod envelope could hypothetically modulate every one of these at once. That would be a pretty wild sound and might really stretch the limits of, your computer, but it is possible. But for now, we just want to modulate one thing, which is the volume of this triangle wave. So what we're going to do, now that we've selected our source, is we're going to go to a target over here, which is the volume of oscillator 2 in our mixer. And we're just going to click on this and drag it up, let's say halfway. And what we're doing now is we're setting the peak. We're setting the limits of this change, right? So when our mod envelope reaches its peak, when it's at 100% intensity, this is the level it will reach, this line here. And, this is the whole scope of what it'll be moving between. At the bottom here, let's say it's 0. Let's say this is 100. So let's just click on this little blue helmet to save it. And you'll notice now there's a little green guy under the helmet. This shows us that there is a link made from this modulator. And if we click on this, it'll show us that link, which is nice. And it's worth noting now that if I wanted to, I could actually set this oscillator to whatever volume I want. And you can see that that amount of modulation is still the same. It's just starting from a different point. So we can consider this sort of to be the floor. This is the 0 point now. It's not going to go below that with this modulation envelope. And it's going to be the same sort of, percent increase from the bottom to the top. You know, and I don't want to really get too lost in the weeds here, but I think that's just worth noting that you can sort of set the amount that you want the modulator to change, and then you can change the starting point, you know, whatever you want it to be, which is nice for sort of fine tuning. That's a whole lot of talking. Let's just listen to what this sound is now. And I'm going to slightly increase the amount so we can really hear that effect. Maybe I'll make that a square wave so it pokes through a little more. Now you can see over here on our parameter, you can see how much it's being modulated in real time. Take a look in case you missed it. Look at the mixer section, especially at the line in the middle of oscillator 2. And you can also see, when you're looking at the modulator envelope, you can see where in this envelope we are at any given time. There's a little line and a ball that's going to be, you know, sort of following the course of this. Take a look at that. Nice. So that is our first modulation, really. And that basic principle of finding out what it is that we want to change, figuring out what we want to use to change it, and setting the amount, that is all that modulation is. Things can get a little bit more complicated when you start, you know, modulating things in rhythmic settings, you know, or you modulate the modulators even, which we'll maybe get into a little bit later on. But just try and break it down into that one process. We're just going to set, you know, what our target is and what we're going to use to change it. And that's it. It's exactly as simple as just changing knobs. There's just a lot more hands than you could ever have, which is nice. So that's the very basic idea of modulation with envelopes. Let's move on to our next source of modulation, which is the LFO. Now, an LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's in concept, it's the same as our oscillators up in the top here, which cycle through a particular shape at a particular frequency, you know, a certain number of times a second. The only difference being that these are low frequency oscillators, so they go through this shape pretty slowly. In this case, they're sort of by default hardwired to be, you know, set to the tempo of whatever song that you're in. You know, in my case, in my DAW, my tempo is 83 beats per minute. If you're using Helm as a standalone, you can change the BPM up here by the arpeggiator and by the oscilloscope. You can change the BPM there. If we click on this, you know, this little S next to it, you can see it's set by default to sync to playhead, which means that this little LFO, this LFO is always in sync, in tempo with whatever you're playing. So I'll, real quick, you know, before getting too far into it, I'll just set this up to some parameter and we can hear it in sync with a little drum loop that I have set up. So let's set it up with what might be a pretty common usage, which is moving the filter up and down. This is an effect that you I think might most easily associate with a dubstep sound. If you set the filter to an LFO, you get sort of a wub, 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 wub sound. So I'll map it to that, you know, maybe not too extreme, but enough that it's audible. And once again, you can see it modulating. And a key difference between the LFOs and the modulator envelopes is that while the envelopes went from 0 to 100, you know, from 0% to 100%, you know, we call them maybe monopolar. They're going one way. LFOs, they have a zero line here in the middle, but they actually go both above it and below it. So you're going to get positive modulation and negative modulation, which is worth considering. If you want something to go just one direction and then back to the starting point, you probably want to use an amplitude envelope. But if you want it to go up and down around a center point, you probably want to use an LFO. In any case, let's save this by clicking on this blue helmet and just hear what it sounds like. And if we set that to be even more extreme and even faster by clicking on this number here in this box and dragging to the right, we'll get a pretty intense effect. And it's worth mentioning, when we're talking about frequency, what we're talking about is how long it takes to go from this starting point all the way through the waveform and back to the start again. Right now, it's going through that once every 2 beats, once every half note. If I set it to 1-1, that's once every bar. And if I set it to this, it's a quarter note. I definitely just got my I just got my rhythms wrong. Ignore me. I'm gonna just turn off the mute on my drum loop, and you can hear that this is actually in sync with the track. And I'll set it back to an 8th note. Which is a pretty neat effect. And there are tons and tons of ways that you can use this to great effect in your track to make sort of, maybe melodically sort of simple synths that really have a lot of rhythmic richness to them. And one thing to note is that just like you have different waveforms in your oscillators, you have different waveforms down in your LFOs too. And a lot of them have different unique uses, especially in modulation. And I'll sort of briefly go over what those uses might be. I don't necessarily have an exhaustive use for every single one of these, but they definitely have their uses, and it's worth playing around with them and really listening to the changes to consider what you might use each of them for. So, right now we have it set to the sine wave, which of course just goes up and down pretty smoothly. And triangle wave, which is similar, but it doesn't sort of linger as long at the peaks. You'll notice that the sine wave it hangs at the top because it sort of has this bell shape to it. Whereas the triangle, it's a bit smoother as far as, it's evenly spread out, I think. It's a fairly slight difference, but, one worth noting. The square wave, incredibly useful in modulation. The reason being that you're just, you're alternating between 2 different values, which, if you know what those 2 values are, can lead to some really awesome effects. I'll play it with the filter right now. Very precise, very, very rhythmic, and, can lead to a lot of unique creative possibilities. One of my favorite effects is, you know what? I'm just going to show you how to delete this real quick. If you want to delete a link, just go ahead and click on the modulator that is affecting something and double click on the parameter that you're changing. It's gone now. So I want to change the tuning of one of my synths over time using this square wave. And I want to have it go up and down an octave. So at its peak, it's going to be up. Well, it's actually going to be up. It's going to go up an octave and then down an octave below the middle point. Because again, these LFOs are bipolar. They go the same amount above and below the 0 point. If you want to go just up, we'll get into using the step sequencer for that in a little bit. But for now, let's just have it go both up an octave and down an octave from the starting point. And you'll hear what that sounds like here. So already we have a basic melodic sequence here, using just an LFO and the transpose knob, which is really awesome. And I really encourage you to check out this effect in particular of, using the LFO to sort of, hard code some changes in your melody, without even having to press more buttons. Like I can hold just one down here. And if I want to, maybe I can get, let's get this second oscillator involved too. Maybe we can have that going up, up and down an octave too. Actually, let's have it go the opposite way. Why not? So now it's going to go down an octave while this is going up an octave and vice versa. Let's hear what it sounds like. Which, that on its own is not the most elegant sound, but it, is a jumping off point for some expression that you can use in your stuff. I'll clear those out for now. Next up, we have the descending sawtooth wave. I'm just going to show you what this sounds like with the filter. I think that's a good place to hear it. So what this is going to do is it's going to go straight down and then jump back to the starting point. So this, again, has a pretty noticeable start and end point and has a clear rhythm, sort of rhythm to it. I'll show it to you. This can be really useful for creating sort of, a bit of maybe a tremolo effect or just a rhythmic, just sort of if you have just a held chord, this can be a good way to just automatically like. That's just holding down a chord. You can automatically create a lot of rhythmic variation there. And you can even, maybe later on we'll get into how to change the frequency of this over time. But, that's a really easy way to get sort of a cool rhythmic synth that's right in line with, whatever you're playing behind it. And sort of similar, the ascending sawtooth wave. Again, equally useful. And this can be good for, useful for sort of creating a sidechain sound, where it starts out low and it increases over time. Especially if you have it in line with the kick. It's sort of, it mimics the effect of, the kick or whatever is on that quarter note, ducking this sound, which is nice. It's elegant insofar as, you don't have to put a compressor on this now, which is nice. Next up in line, we have a stepped sine, or not stepped sine, just a stepped wave. This is sort of similar in functionality to the square wave. The difference being that, it has this bottom point, it has a top point, but it also stops for an equal amount of time in the middle here. So if we do sort of the same effect we had earlier, where we set it to the transpose and we have it going up an octave, now it's going to go down, middle, up in each for the same amount of time. Let's hear what that sounds like. Obviously now it has a pretty immediate triplet sound, which can also be really useful in a lot of stuff. So you can use this similarly to the way you would use a square wave. And next up we have, similar idea. It's the four-stepped wave. And this, I actually don't know how far above and below the middle line these steps here are. Let's give it a listen. I'm not sure this will necessarily sound good. Oh, it's so close. It's so close to being useful melodically. I would wager it's falling about 10% on each side. Or, well, no, it'd be, it'd probably be 12.5%, because this, I would guess, would be 25. or something like that. Oh no, 33. It would be 16% above each side, so not an especially useful number, but it's there. And similar one more time. Which, if you're not necessarily going for precise pitches here, that's a cool little arpeggiator built in. Might be useful. Let's hear it on the filter. This is cool because, again, it has a really consistent rhythm to it, so it might be useful for, say, a more percussive sound. But let's hear what it sounds like on the filter. That's cool. It's sort of a similar effect, because you can see now this is getting similar to the shape of our ascending sawtooth wave. But this is nice because it has little notches in it. So you have sort of a rhythm built into it on top of just that sort of swelling sound. So you have, now if we play it with the drums. Nice. Yeah, I think that can be... Oh no. There we go. I think that could be a really useful effect, sort of rhythmically for a pad to create some, some stepping along the way. Sorry, just setting up my window again. Really love a second monitor one of these days. Anyway, so now we have... I don't know what I would call this exactly. What's the name of this thing? 3 pyramid. It's sort of similar to the 3-step one that we had earlier, except now it's middle up, middle down. So, this will give a largely similar effect to the 3-step that we heard earlier, except now, it's going to go... middle up, middle down. Again, very useful. I'm just going to play this one. This is sort of like a stepped triangle wave almost. Whoa. That's got a sort of intense, it almost sounds like a disaster piece. Like some dark fez sound there. Next we have a very stepped triangle. Again, certainly could be useful. I feel, at least melodically, pretty situational, but I think there's lots of stuff that you could map to that. And, as with any of these, I think if you're going for a more rhythmically precise LFO that is going to sort of act as a bit of a percussive element in your mix, definitely consider these. I think they're really awesome for that. Lastly, we have 2 really useful functions. One of which is this is a random stepped LFO. So what that means is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 6 times, each cycle, it's going to pick a different, value to have, either above or below. And it's going to stay at that for 1/6 of whatever this frequency is. So 1/6 of a quarter note. And here's what that sounds like on, let's do it on the filter. I think I might have been wrong. I think it's in fact, it could be in fact that it's every quarter note it picks a new one. I think that is the case. But this, yeah, I think it is every quarter note it picks a new sort of value to hold for the length of that frequency. Which can be really nice if you're going for something that has a bit more of a generative quality to it, where it's not the same every single time, but you still want to have sort of a rhythmic change. So you have, these steps in it rather than having just a random value that changes over the course of the frequency. It's going to be, every quarter note or every, 8th note, 16th note, whatever. It just picks a new value and stays at that, which is cool. And conversely, we have just true random. But it's sort of, it's a random, it's sort of like a Perlin noise almost, for people who are familiar with computing at all, where it's not true random. It's not just picking a random point all the time, but it's sort of, sort of interpolating between two different random values at a couple points during each frequency. So it's basically just going up and down a lot, all the time, which can be really useful for a lot of different things. One thing that I will often use this for is I will sort of use it to emulate the sound of a tape warble, where, tapes, when you are playing them, playing them back, especially if you have the tape belts are getting worn out or something, and like it's a sort of chewed up tape, it'll start to play at varying speeds, constantly. But these aren't always regular. A lot of people choose to map, choose to change, say, the tuning of a synth. They'll change the tuning of a synth with a sine wave, which I do. I've done it in a lot of the videos in this playlist, and I'll show you what that sounds like. Which does sort of approximate that effect. And if you only have a sine wave as your LFO on your synth, I think definitely use this. It can be really useful for that. But I feel like it's a bit too perfect. It's a bit too even. And I really like the sound of this random wave because it's unpredictable. It's not super consistent. It's not super rhythmic. It's just sort of like... there will be times where it just sort of drags. And you can, of course, set it faster and it'll go through it faster. Yeah. And I think it sort of more accurately emulates that sound of a tape deck. And actually, this brings me to a thought that I think I may as well bring up now. This is going to be a long video, it occurs to me, because I have a lot of feelings about modulators. I hope you're in it for the long haul. This is probably going to be like an hour, but I'm happy to do it. So, yeah, one really useful things about all these LFOs, I'm just going to turn this frequency down because this ball is driving me nuts. One really useful thing about all of these frequent LFO modulators is that each of them has a strength function built in. So right now, this little bar here to the left of this LFO is set all the way full, which means that, for our sine wave, for example, this, whatever value it's outputting, let's say it's between 0 and 1 on each side. So it's 0, the top is 1, the bottom is -1. It's at full strength. It's going to change, the tuning. For example, we have it set to the tuning. It's going to change the tuning by its maximum, amount. If we change this, we make the wave smaller. And now if we set it to 50%, now it's going between 0.5 and -0.5. And you can see, I'm just going to increase this amount so we can see the effect. If it's at full strength, you can see it's going almost all the way to each side. That's how much the tuning is changing. Really lovely sound. But if we change this strength down to about half, it's only going half of that distance. It's going, from the center point to about halfway, and same on the other side. And if we set it to 0, there's no effect at all. If we set it to the negative, then it inverts this. Which basically just means that, instead of going high, then low, it's just going low first, then high, which can be useful when you start to think about some of these other waves. It can, it can just change, if you have, say, a rhythmic thing set up, it'll just change. Hello, motorcycle outside. it'll just change the melody, for example, that you have set up to this. But one really useful thing that I am bringing up because of this is that not only can you change the strength of this, which on its own is, sort of useful, you can change the intensity of this with another modulator, which is amazing. So for example, if I wanted to start my sound out without any change to the tuning, but I wanted to gradually increase the change in tuning as the sound goes on, what I can do is I can start this at 0 and grab my handy dandy mod envelope, map it to my target, which is the strength of this LFO. And now, as this sound goes on and my mod envelope goes up, so is the intensity of my LFO going to go. I think that was a grammatical sentence. Here's what it sounds like. So this, in my mind, can be an incredibly powerful tool. The ability to change the strength of an LFO over time, especially if you have that LFO mapped to a bunch of stuff. This means that you can change, with a single modulator over here, you can change a bunch of different parameters at once and the intensity of those parameters. And I think a great way to use this is by mapping the strength of this to one of our keyboard modulators, which I'm going to come back to the Poly LFO and step sequencer after this because I think they're really important. But let's talk about the keyboard mods, our third type of modulator. So the keyboard mods, you do, more or less have to have a MIDI keyboard to really make use of these. I think you should have one in general if you're working on synthesis or whatever on a computer. I think it just makes it easier. But in any case, I have a MIDI keyboard in front of me. I'm going to make use of these, and I'm going to talk you through what they do. So the keyboard mods, they basically change every time. Well, most of them change every time you hit a new note on your keyboard. Aftertouch changes, note changes, velocity changes, random changes. Mod wheel and pitch wheel are a little different. But these four, a new value is set every time you press a key on your keyboard. And this, sort of like the mod envelope, this is not bipolar, like the Poly LFOs. This is monopolar. It goes one direction from more or less 0 to 100. So, if I am going to set, say, the velocity to the amount of my sub, right? And I set it about halfway. So now my sub starts at 0, and it's only ever going to go from 0 to that point I set. Not going to go below, not going to go above the point I set. And now if I, press some buttons, depending on how hard I hit, you can see, it just, it picks a level and it stays there depending on what the amount of velocity, it's detecting from my keyboard is. And velocity is just, how hard you're hitting the keyboard. When you're working with MIDI in your MIDI editor, you can also set that manually. I'm not going to get too much into that now, but, you don't have to be using a keyboard for that. It more means like these are referring to parameters or settings of the MIDI information. Mine's coming from a keyboard. It will also read it if it's coming from your MIDI editor. That's an aside. Anyway, so, these keyboard mods, they can be really useful for a lot of different things. I really like to map the velocity of, of my keyboard mod to the strength of an LFO. So let's say, we start at 0 for that. I'm just going to go ahead and, boom, map that to full strength. So now, however hard I hit my velocity, that's going to increase the strength of that LFO, which in turn is going to be increasing the strength of this detune. So we have, just to really clear it up, we have velocity is turning this knob, and then this LFO is turning that knob. And depending on how much the velocity is affecting the LFO, that determines how much the LFO is affecting the tune knob. It can get a little bit complex, but I encourage you to just break it down into sort of a chain. And each time you connect a modulator and a target to each other, you make a link. And then you can link a chain together. And it's worth considering, where you're starting that chain, and just sort of talk through it, or write out a plan of what, here's what I want to change, X, Y, Z things. But in any case, so now, depending on how hard I hit the keys, if I hit rather hard, I'll get that sound. If I hit very softly, it won't change very much at all. Once again, very hard. It's not the most beautiful sound as it stands right now, but it's neither here nor there. So that's velocity. Delete that for now. Aftertouch, largely similar. My keyboard has aftertouch, and I have not gotten this to really work. It's basically once you press a key, you can push down harder, and it should detect how hard you're pushing. So this is a way to sort of, over time, change a parameter. I have not yet gotten it to work. The aftertouch on my keyboard isn't amazing, so it might just be something on my end, not Helm's end, not sure. But it's largely comparable to velocity. Note. This is an interesting one. So note is something that is going to, depending on how low or high the note is, that's going to determine the amount of the effect. So the higher the note, the higher the effect is going to be. If you consider the low end of a piano, for example, to be 0, and the highest note to be 100, that's pretty much, what this is. So if I set note to the filter envelope amount here, and I'm just going to set it all the way so we can really hear it. Now, if I press a very low note, my filter envelope is all the way down. And if I set it pretty high, it's increased quite a bit. So that can be a really useful thing for a number of reasons, especially when you're trying to sort of create a fairly realistic synth, or one that at least models in some ways sort of how real instruments behave, where certain parameters change, the higher the note is. You might get more noise, for example, if you're trying to play a flute because you have to use more breath. You might get more of a certain frequency. If you're playing a guitar, you might get less of a certain frequency. It's all stuff to consider. And it's worth noting also, even though, all of these, by default, it's a number that's going from 0 to 100. You can also map it to be inverted, which, I don't think I just explained that very well. But basically, rather than, increasing from that amount, if you just, grab your parameter, let's say I want, for some reason, the filter to go down the higher the note goes. Well, you just grab it and you go down, and that's it. So now if I pick a low note, the filter is going to be high. And if I pick a high note, the filter is going to be low. Does not super work as far as audibility, but that's what it is. Next on the docket, we have, let's do random, which is exactly what it sounds like. Every time you press a note, it's just going to be a random setting between, 0 and whatever you set here. So now, if I wanted to, every time I press a note, it's going to be between 0 and like this point. So it's going to increase the filter by that much. Let's hear it. And it's worth noting that random is bipolar. Velocity, note, etc. I believe to be monopolar, they only go in one direction. Random is not the same. It is like the LFOs, it can go either direction by that amount. So just a consideration. This can be super useful for generative stuff. I'll probably do a couple videos on generative synth making in Helm at some point, and this will be, you know, a big part of it. Lastly, mod wheel and pitch wheel. These, not every keyboard has them. Mine does. I find it super useful. Mod wheel in particular is an incredibly useful thing to use, particularly with LFO Strength. I'm going to go over this in, I think, my chiptune video, which I have made after this, or made before this, but I've placed after it in this playlist. Anyway, I go over it in that video, but you can map the mod wheel to the LFO amount. And now that's just a way, and, you know, I'll just do the exact thing I do in that video because it's a good highlight. I'm just going to map it to the strength of this LFO here. Bada bing, bada boom. And I'm going to map this to the detune. And now we're going to get a classic sort of vibrato sound. Okay, but instead of it playing all the time, it's only going to be when I'm increasing the mod wheel on my keyboard. So let's hear it. Let's increase my filter amount. Not super audible. Let's see if I can. I'm just going to increase this so we can really exaggerate the effect. Oh, hold on. You know what it might be? Oh, that is playing. Why are you being silly? All right. Yeah, you can hear it there. I'm going to slow it down a little bit so you can hear a bit more. So yeah, that's a great way to sort of, if you have a couple of particular effects that you want to have as accents, you know, that's a great way while you're playing to sort of just add them in key moments. And there's lots of different ways that you can use that. And pitch wheel, largely similar. Just uses the pitch wheel instead of the mod wheel. That I think might be bipolar. Let me see. It's also perhaps not the industry standard term for things that go both ways, but it is in my head. Yeah, that's bipolar, so it can go both ways. So that is, you know, basically the keyboard mods. And lastly, I'm just going to go over these final two modulator sources that I haven't done yet, and maybe give just a couple of, oh, going to move that over. So I'm just going to give a couple more uses of these two, and then I'll talk a little bit about some common ways that LFOs are used in synth design. This is all stuff I'm going to be getting back to throughout the series, but I thought it would be useful to have this in a pretty in-depth video early on, because this is stuff that we're going to be going over a lot, and it's good to get this idea down. So anyway, Poly LFO. Let me clear this out. Okay, so the Poly LFO. Let's get into the way that things are routed in Helm real quick. So in Helm, you have these two main oscillators, a sub-oscillator, and a noise oscillator. These are the start of the chain of sound in Helm. Everything else goes after these. You mix them together, and then that mixed signal goes to the amplitude envelope. The amplitude envelope controls the overall sound, or the overall volume of the synthesizer. Any effects and stuff that you put on after the fact are not affected by the amplitude envelope. They are after the fact. I say that. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the distortion might also be affected by the amplitude envelope. Not 100%. But the important thing to consider is the amplitude envelope comes before certain other things in the chain. This mixed signal is controlled at, like, all of the voices are controlled at once by these LFOs. So if I have 4 different voices, let's say, meaning I can play 4 different notes at the same time. Let's get this sub down. Let's get this oscillator down. If I have those 4 notes playing at the same time, and I have, for example, the filter envelope mapped to an LFO, all of those 4 notes are going to go up and down, or the frequency, the filter on all of those 4 notes is going to go up and down together, right? Easy enough, makes enough sense. It's all one sound. The Poly LFO, however, does not quite work this way. It can change on a per voice basis. Meaning, for example, if I have the Poly LFO going to the tuning, and I have 4 voices, if I play voice 1, and you know what, I'm going to make this a square wave, and I'm going to make this an octave, so we can really hear it. Let's make it this one. Now, each time a new voice begins, so each time I press a key, this Poly LFO begins cycling for that voice. And I'm just going to show you what it sounds like and explain it a bit more after. Let's see, let me get the filter back up so you can maybe hear it a little more. Bit of a mess there, but hopefully, and let me slow this down, hopefully you can hear that those melodies are not in sync with each other. If we had, say, if we had the same wave going at the same speed to the same thing, let's set the strength of this to 0 so it's not doing anything. Here's what it sounds like if I start a key and I press another key and I press another key. No matter when the voice starts, it's coming in at the same point in the LFO, right? So all of those changes are in sync with each other. Not so with the Poly LFO. It can very much be the case that each of them is at a totally different point in this waveform, which is really useful for lots of things. One of which is the example I gave there. Another is, like, let's say, this is a sound I sometimes like of sort of a chime, or, a bit of, well, I'll just play it. Let's get that, speed it up a little bit. Of sort of a, fast moving, but not, necessarily in sync little, almost delay effects, basically. And another really good use for it is the sine wave. And let's get that off of transpose and onto tune. What's great with this is that now we can have a detune on a per voice level, meaning that you're going to get a lot of richness and sort of chorusing effect and phasing effect, because all of these are being, they're all in slightly different tune. So you're getting a really broad sound. And this is sort of similar in a lot of ways to the unison effect here. But let's hear what it sounds like. Nice. I'm not going to get too much into the to the weeds with the Poly LFO, but the core idea behind it is that rather than putting every voice through the same LFO. We are rather doing it on a per voice basis. So you can have 4, even though they're using the same shape, basically the modulator is coming in at different points in the shape, 4 different voices. That's, the basis of it. And I think, could talk for a while about that and, possible uses for it, but I think I'd rather move on to the step sequencer instead. So finally, the step sequencer, which I think is one of the coolest things in Helm, is like an LFO, and it's a bit like a filter envelope, in that it is a repeating structure that is in sync by default. It's in sync with the track, but unlike the LFOs, you can draw in a shape that you like. Let's say I like that shape. And let's say I map that to the frequency of the filter. Let's say I map it in a bigger way. And let's say this is 16th notes. See what it sounds like. And you can very easily create really great rhythms with this that can, really, there's a lot of potential in this for creating interesting sequences, on whatever parameter you want. I mean, this is functionally, it is a sequencer for every parameter on your synth. And I could sort of wax poetic about the potential of this for a while, but hopefully you'll just see in some of the synths that I make throughout this series what you can do with this. Excuse me. It's really great. And you can increase the number of steps to make a very long sequence. You could decrease them, to just 2 to make sort of a variable depth square wave, more or less. Where you have a fairly low peak and a fairly low trough and a fairly high peak. You could set a slide between notes, which is just going to, rather than going, jumping from one to the other, it's going to do sort of a glide between them, which if I set this pretty slow, you can hear what that sounds like. And one trick that you could do with this, if we make this fairly long, is that you could, let's zero this out more or less. Ba-da-doom, ba-doom. Okay, you could treat this as another envelope. And here's how. This is a little, mad science here. But let's set this to a fairly high frequency. And let's do a bunch of steps. What we have here basically is a line with intensity up and down and time, and it's moving through at a pretty steady rate. Now, the one downside is you can't do sustain with this, but if you want to just draw a shape that changes over time, you can with this. And rather than looping through in sync with the your DAW or whatever, you can set it, and you can set any of these LFOs, by the way, to start when you click the note. So now, if I wanted to have an effect that, let's say, gradually rose, sustained for a little while, and dropped back down, and then came back up, something I can't do with my other step sequencer, or my other envelopes. I could do that. And now, let's say if I want that to be the frequency, and I want it to go up like that, let's hear what that sounds like. So that is, you know, one potential use for the step sequencer that I have not, gone too in-depth in. But it just occurred to me a little bit earlier today. And I thought I would probably explore a little bit more in later videos. But that just shows you some of the open-endedness of that particular function. I mean, you can use it, to draw whatever shape you want and sort of chart it out over time. I think it's really exciting. But I've been talking for a while, and I think my brain is starting to get modulated by all of these things. So I'm just going to do a quick wrap up before I get too rambly. So what have we learned? We've learned that a modulator is basically it's an automated knob turner. You find out what it is that you want to change over time, and then you figure out what it is that you want to change it. You select the little helmet next to your modulator, and then you click on your target. You change it. You set the amount that you want it to change by, which is going to be the maximum. And depending on whether you use an envelope or an LFO, it's either going to go just up to that point, or it's sort of going to revolve around that axis in both ways by the same amount. Going to clear that out. You can clear it out by double clicking on the thing. Beautiful. You can even modulate the amount of modulators. You can modulate the amount that an LFO is changing things by. You can set that with virtually any of the modulators. There are just a ludicrous amount of things that you can modulate in Helm. Pretty awesome. And I'll get into lots of the cool tricks you can do with that throughout this series. But that is the fundamental basics of it. I hope I didn't get anything too wrong in this. I think I might slightly misunderstand how retrigger works. I seem to recall that I have before gotten retrigger to work the way that it works in my mind, which is that it starts when you press the button. It works like that for the LFOs, but it is seeming not to do so much for the step sequencer. Perhaps it's too long. I'll mess around with it in my own time. In any case, that's the basics of this all. I appreciate you sticking around for this long if you have. And I look forward to making some crazy synths with all this information throughout the course of this series. Have a good night, and please feel free to leave me a comment if there's anything that I totally got wrong or you don't quite understand. I'm happy to walk through some stuff with you. And that's all. Enjoy.